What happens when institutions become more invested in their own survival than the purpose or mission for which they were created? This is not a question about good institutions versus bad institutions. It's a question about systems. And throughout history, organizations and institutions have generally been created to solve a problem, protect interests, provide services, advance ideas. But over time, many face a challenge: how to continue remaining focused on their mission while also ensuring their own survival. So, to explore that question, I want to look at a recent example, something that's been in the news quite a bit this year. Let's look at immigration and protests, and the response to these acts that have been going on in some of our cities. This year, immigration has dominated the headlines on a quite regular basis. We've seen news about enforcement actions, protests, demonstrations, and how the government has responded to each of these. And depending on where you get your news, you may have encountered a dramatically different interpretation of the very same events from your neighbor, maybe even from your partner or your friends, your family. But rather than asking who is right, which is where we have often been caught up, let's ask a different question. How did the institutions involved respond? So, from the perspective of human rights organizations, well, they mobilized supporters and emphasized the issues of individual rights and justice for the most part. Political parties, well, they interpreted these events through their existing electoral priorities. Media organizations, well, they highlighted different aspects of the story depending on who the focused audience was and making it relevant to their particular audience. And the government defended their actions through their legal authority, public safety, and enforcement responsibilities. But what is fascinating is that each institution appeared to be acting rationally according to its purpose. Law enforcement agencies tend to view events through the lens of compliance of the law and public order. Advocacy organizations tend to view these very same events through the lens of human rights and justice. And political parties interpret, again, the same events through the lens of current opinion. So each perspective contains elements of truth. All can be true at the same time. I think we've been conditioned to think that it's one or the other, black or white, one or two, here or there. But we have perhaps failed to think that sometimes even differing facts or events can all be true at the same time. And each perspective is also shaped by the institution's role within that society. So this raises an interesting question for me. Can institutions ever fully escape their own perspective? Or does every organization eventually interpret reality through the lens of its mission, its incentives, and ultimately its own survival? I propose that we observe what each one does when they're under pressure, because often pressure is what reveals what an individual or an organization believes it has to protect. So that then left me thinking about fear. Fear as a tool. I want to be clear, fear is not unique to any one group or political party. It's not unique to any one ideology or any one way of thinking. And it certainly is not unique to any one moment in history. But fear is one of the most effective governing tools ever discovered, because fear changes behavior. When people feel safe, they tend to ask questions and explore new ideas. When people feel threatened, they tend to seek protection. And throughout history, new governments have often emerged as the answer to public safety, promising that protection. So that led me to another question. How much danger actually then exists, let's say today? And how much danger is actually being overemphasized? Let's go back to immigration. One narrative presents immigration as a national security issue. The focus is on crime, border security, drug trafficking, all public safety. Let's look at Greg Bovino, one of the top Border Patrol security officers who was active in the immigration actions in Minnesota earlier this year. Well, just a short time ago, within the last few weeks, he was recently in Portugal. And he was advocating and speaking about mass deportations of immigrants, people of color, in white countries. Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, very similarly, has been very open in speaking in his official capacity on the immigrant invasion taking place in the US and in Europe. And he's not shy to declare that it has to be stopped at all costs. So that's one side of the coin. The other narrative presents immigration primarily as a human rights issue. The focus is on families, asylum seekers, economic contributions by immigrants in this country, and human rights. From this perspective, the lens comes from the history of the United States interfering in political affairs of other countries. Yes, we know that happens. It's recently happening now in Iran, but let's look at Latin America. This interference has left ruthless dictators in power for decades, and they have been supported by the American government as long as they denounce any systems of socialism and or support friendly economic policies for the American extraction of natural resources. Take Chile, for example, El Salvador and Nicaragua in the 1980s. All of these American interventions resulted in the ruthless regimes that produce a mass exodus of people who eventually are fleeing horrific violence. But it's a violence that often has been institutionally established by the American government. So that's the other side of the coin. Both elements, both narratives contain elements of reality. But the same issue produces two entirely different emotional responses. One produces concern, the other produces fear. And fear is very powerful. I propose that this is the same dynamic that appears in the new controversies surrounding political protests and First Amendment expressions. One observer sees citizens exercising constitutional rights. Another sees social unrest and threats to public order. One sees protected free speech. The other sees disorder. Again, the question is not which interpretation is correct. The question is why certain institutions emphasize certain interpretations over others. When we look at history, we see that institutions gain authority when citizens feel vulnerable and unprotected. It's a security versus liberty trade-off. When people perceive danger, they're often more willing to accept expanded government authority in exchange for protection. And history is filled with these examples. Through wars, after terrorist attacks, after an economic crisis. In each case, the government frequently acquires new powers that would have been politically difficult to get during a peaceful period. So that then brings us to an important constitutional concept that's also been in the news this week: habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is the legal protection that requires that the government justify the detention of an individual before a court. So in simple terms, it helps prevent people from being imprisoned indefinitely without any legal review. And for centuries, this has been considered one of the foundational safeguards against arbitrary government power. And it matters because it forces us to think about another larger question. How much freedom are citizens willing to exchange for a promise of safety? After 9/11, the Patriot Act allowed for the monitoring of phone calls, emails, and even your library records. What you checked out could be reported to the government. And that then takes us to another question, and maybe even a more important one. Who gets to decide what threat is serious enough to justify that exchange of personal liberties for protection? Once powers are expanded, history has shown us that they rarely contract voluntarily. While some aspects of the Patriot Act have in fact expired, others continue to be renewed. So, an important question is not really if the threat exists. Yes, threat exists, very real threats. But the more important question is whether our perception of the threat is actually proportional to the reality of the threat. Because every institution has incentives. Governments have incentives. Political parties have incentives. Media organizations, as for profit corporations, have incentives. Private companies have incentives. I propose that understanding and questioning these incentives may actually be one of the most important forms of citizenship in a democratic society. Perhaps the most dangerous construct is not the status of immigration, documented versus undocumented, or even political parties, Democrat versus Republican, or the media, MSN versus Fox News, or even the government. Perhaps the most dangerous construct is fear itself, because fear has the ability to transform free people into obedient people without force, without violence, but with silent consent. And a population that feels under attack will often surrender freedoms it would otherwise never relinquish during times of peace. And a population that feels unsafe will often accept authority it would otherwise question. And history has shown us this pattern already. The question is not again if the threat exists. Threats exist. The question is whether we are seeing those threats clearly, or whether we're seeing them through the narratives carefully orchestrated by institutions that benefit from our fear. And that leads me then to a bigger, more uncomfortable question. What if the greatest threat to our democratic society is not the enemy that we think we perceive, but rather, what if the greatest threat is the gradual erosion of our ability to distinguish genuine danger from perceived danger? Because once that distinction is blurred, almost anything can be justified. More surveillance, more control, like social media corporations sharing information with the government. More censorship, like banning of books, restricting free speech. Government dictating curriculum in public and private schools. More authority, like military agents and federal agents in the streets and possibly at voting locations, all in the name of protection. And do you think it could not happen? So, this is how I propose constructs become reality. Not necessarily because they're true, and it's because enough people believe them to be true. So today, I leave you with a question. When you're watching the news on your favorite platform, or scrolling through your social media, or when you hear politicians speak, when you see corporations in the company of government officials, ask yourself, who benefits if I become more afraid tomorrow than I am today? Because the answer to that question may actually tell you more and give you awareness about power than any headline in the news today. And awareness begins with questions.